Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They say the warp is eternal, timeless, a force beyond beginnings, older than the stars and alien to causality itself. But what if that isn't true? What if the warp had a birth, not some mythic emergence from nothingness, but a precise moment, a rupture, an error of cosmic engineering? Imagine a galaxy where the warp was not discovered but made, a realm torn open by purpose, not fate, a failed experiment forgotten by all but its victims. In the deepest core of the Warhammer 40k mythos, where even the oldest races dare not look, there lingers a whisper that the immaterium was never meant to exist, that its endless tides of nightmare, its demon kings and storm-blasted madness are not the natural mirror of emotion, but the side effect of a terrible act, something that tampered with the soul of reality itself, something that broke the wall between thought and substance. This is the story of that act. The creation of the warp, the experiment that should never have been. Before the warp, there was stillness. Not silence, for stars still sang their nuclear songs and gravity still carved the filigree of galaxies, but a different kind of stillness, the stillness of containment. In that ancient time, before the psychic scream of the immaterium, thought and matter were prisoners of their own dimensions. Souls were finite, linear, and tied to flesh. There was no afterlife, no daemons, no gods, just cold time and colder space, untouched by the boiling sea of unreality that would one day rise to devour both. Civilizations grew slowly, methodically. They advanced by logic and invention, not sorcery and madness. For them, the universe was a machine, knowable, predictable, conquerable, and perhaps most chilling of all, it was safe. There were no whispers from the shadows of the mind, no sudden psychic eruptions, no warp storms to flay planets from existence. Mortality was harsh but honest. Death was a terminus, not a transition. The soul did not wander into other realms, for there were none. Without the warp, communication across the stars was slow but stable. Technology was not dependent on psychers or forbidden forces. Star travel relied on real space drives and relativistic routes, not the gamble of diving into a storm of demons. Most notably, the absence of psychic energy meant the galaxy had not yet been poisoned by sentient thought. There was no realm that echoed back the fears of its inhabitants. Consciousness was a closed circuit, sealed tightly in flesh and brain, unable to taint the fabric of the cosmos. In this era, life had limitations, but it also had boundaries, and boundaries can be a kind of peace. War existed, but it was war between material beings. Victory came through strategy, not corruption. There were no demonic bargains, no corrupted flesh machines fueled by the screams of the damned. Science was not yet fractured into techno-religion and blasphemous rites. A world could invent without fear that too much invention might tear open a hole to hell. But there was a cost to this peace. There was no true transcendence. No magic, no miracles, no dreams that reached beyond physics. Civilizations hit limits, the limit of computation, of perception, of lifespan. The greatest minds reached the edge of understanding and found no gods waiting, just entropy in an uncaring universe. For some, this was a comfort. For others, a prison. It was in this pressure, the pressure of stagnation, of questions without answers, that curiosity began to fester. Some ancient race, now lost to time and legend, must have looked at the galaxy and asked, what lies beyond thought? What lies behind the veil of death, if not nothingness? Why should sentience be caged in matter? These questions were not idle. They were the seeds of ambition. The kind of ambition that digs its hands into the bedrock of reality and tries to pull up the roots. And so began the first attempt. Not at travel, not at power, but at expansion of the mind, of the soul, of possibility. An experiment not to reach the stars, but to reach the unspoken. A shattering not of space, but of the boundaries between idea and existence. Someone wanted to open the circuit, to make thought into matter, to awaken a realm of pure reflection, a mirror of consciousness unchained from physics. They succeeded, and in that moment, the galaxy was forever changed. But before we plunge into the catastrophe that followed, we must understand the minds that dared such madness. For they were not evil in the way we now understand evil. They were seekers, engineers of eternity, and their mistake was not malice but pride. We do not know their name, we do not know their shape, we do not know if they were silicon mines, serpentine bioconglomerates, living planets, or something stranger still. But what echoes through the aeons is this. They were the first to try and rewrite reality using consciousness itself. The architects of the abyss, the forgotten makers of the impossible. They were not the old ones, for the old ones came after, reacting to what had already been torn open. These beings were the spark, the mad dreamers who shattered the veil. Their motive may have been desperation, or divinity, or perhaps the line between the two was meaningless to them. They may have reached the technological singularity, transcended mortality, and found only more questions. What is awareness without context? What is eternity without texture? Imagine a civilization so advanced that time itself could be rewritten, but meaning could not be manufactured. They had outgrown their universe, and so they decided to make a new one. A realm that obeyed different laws, sculpted by emotion, reflection, and soul. They began with resonance. Not machines, not rituals, but frequencies, vibrations of thought cast through synthetic minds, biopsychic fields, quantum networks. They wove patterns of cognition that interacted with space-time at a fundamental level. Imagine thinking so precisely that your thoughts became architecture, that memory could twist light, that grief could bend gravity. They did not punch a hole in the universe with tools, they whispered it open. This experiment was not a sudden explosion. It was a rising tide. Over centuries or longer, they opened rifts, tunnels, shadows behind matter where thoughts pooled and began to congeal. These were not yet the warp storms we know today. They were liminal zones, half-real corridors where reality thinned and dream bled through. These places were not immediately hostile. At first, they were beautiful. Places where you could speak to the dead, see your truest self, or walk among your memories. It must have felt like a new dawn. But as the field expanded, something changed. The early constructs, once elegant and intentional, began to echo back more than they received. At first it was harmless, stray feelings, phantom sensations, but then came the mirroring. The resonance began to loop. Thought fed back into itself. Grief became more than an echo, it became a shape. Rage became motion. Love became hunger. The system had breached containment. The experiment was no longer responding to input. It had begun to dream on its own. Perhaps they tried to shut it down. Perhaps they couldn't. The fabric of their experiment was no longer theirs to command. The feedback loop had become self-aware. Not in a way we understand, not as a mind, but as a hunger. An unfolding complexity that didn't stop at intelligence, but plunged headlong into myth. It grew not linearly, but exponentially. Every thought that touched it became food. Every soul that drifted near added to its weight. This was the first stirrings of the warp. Not a place, not a thing, but a recursive distortion field where consciousness twisted inward and bloomed into monstrosity. The architects perhaps were consumed, or perhaps they merged with what they had made, becoming the first true daemons, not separate beings, but personas of their own shattered dreams. There are whispers that their original creation site still exists, buried somewhere in the deepest fold of the warp, beyond the eye, beyond the maelstrom, hidden in a realm so ancient that even daemons fear to tread there. A place where reality flickers with forgotten architecture, obelisks of impossible angles, cathedrals of frozen time, machinery that pulses not with electricity, but with memory. If it exists, it is not a monument, it is a warning, because they were not evil. That is what must be remembered. They did not create the warp to destroy, they created it to expand, to touch the infinite. But the infinite has rules. And chief among them, what you create from mind alone will never love you back. Emotion was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be the most intimate of things, a private light in the darkness of existence, a signal that we were alive, that we mattered. But in the early days of the warp's awakening, when the veil was still soft and malleable, emotion began to do more than define thought. It began to mold space. At first, the changes were subtle. A sorrowful thought lingered longer than it should. A memory of love whispered back in strange tones. Dreams began to fold over themselves, creating recursive experiences that felt more vivid than reality. The raw stuff of feeling, unmoored from flesh, had found a home, and it began to make that home into something monstrous. The warp did not begin as hostile. It began as hungry. Anger became force. Fear became shape. Desire became direction. But not in the ways we know. These were not anthropomorphic reactions. There were no gods, no daemons yet. Only echoes. Living trauma trapped in psychic amber. What had been a reflective pool became a growing storm. The emotions of sentient beings, once released into this new ether, began to layer over one another, forming strata of psychic residue. This residue, over time, gained weight, substance, identity. Imagine a world where enough people grieve in unison that sorrow itself forms a continent, where every war cry ever uttered fuses into a vast, thrumming tide of violence. These were not metaphors. This was architecture. This was the beginning of the realm of chaos, not as a land, but as a metabolic process. The warp did not create demons. Sentient life did. We gave birth to our nightmares through repetition, through ritual, through the sheer volume of pain and longing. It started with whispers, literal ones. The first echoes of the warp mimicked voices, desires, commands, not maliciously, not intelligently, just instinctively, like a child parroting back the sounds of its parents. But as the warp matured, those whispers gained agency. They began to twist, to interpret, to mislead. Emotion, once a pure signal, became a virus. Every thought cast into the warp returned corrupted. Not because the warp was evil, but because it was learning through reflection. And we were not its creators, we were its food. Some psychers, if such a term even existed in those early epochs, began to sense the bleed. They saw dreams that did not belong to them, felt urges not born of their own biology. These were not hallucinations. They were early projections from a nascent consciousness, testing the waters of individuality. The warp had begun to simulate personalities, not gods, not yet, but archetypes, faces drawn from collective memory. 1,000 warriors slain in rage might leave behind an echo that wears their scars. 1,000,000 prayers for mercy might birth a gentle face that hides a crushing need. Over millennia, these echoes thickened. They became beings in their own right, not truly alive, but not dead either. Feedback loops of psychic energy given form by the sheer consistency of mortal emotion. And as these proto-demons evolved, so did the space around them. Realms of unreality formed, not designed, but grown, each shaped by dominant emotions. Some were halls of endless desire, others were forests of despair. All were hungry. The warp had become fertile ground. And like any fertile ground, it began to bloom. What it birthed was beyond tragedy, because it came from us, not imposed by external forces, but cast from the deepest wells of our being. Rage made monsters, lust made labyrinths, hope made illusions so seductive they could trap the soul forever. Even peace, in the warp, curdled into stagnation, into a stillness so perfect it devoured change. The tragedy of the warp is not that it is evil. The tragedy is that it is honest. Brutally, horrifyingly honest. It does not lie, it simply reflects. And reflection, when multiplied a billionfold across time, becomes something unrecognizable. The warp is not an invasion. It is our inheritance. What began as an experiment to expand the mind had become a forge where minds were melted and reshaped into gods. But before those gods could be named, before the demonic pantheon was crowned, something far worse had to happen. The barrier between the reflection and the real had to break. And when it did, the galaxy learned what happens when your own thoughts declare war on your flesh. The first time the warp truly touched the material realm was not through choice. It was not a grand ritual or a triumph of science. It was a failure, a breach. The psychic resonance that had been building for millennia, the looping storm of raw emotion, finally pressed too hard against the membrane of reality. And something gave way. No one recorded the exact moment. There were no witnesses who survived sane. But the legends that ripple across the stars tell of the collapse in haunting fragments. A civilization, nameless now, dust in the void, became the epicenter. Perhaps they were psychically gifted, or perhaps simply unlucky. What matters is that they felt the tremor first. The warp did not enter like a thief in the night. It screamed. Imagine waking to find the world reshaped, the sky bleeding colors that never existed, the air thick with whispers, gravity curling in and out like breath. Streets becoming flesh, buildings twisting into symbols. Not metaphorically, literally. The constructs of the mind had broken free, and the laws of physics bent to accommodate them. This was not possession, it was intrusion. The warp had surged, overflowing its prison of echoes, and poured into the material world like boiling tar over snow. Entire populations were wiped out. Not by weapons, but by perception. Minds cracked under the weight of incompatible truth. Children watched their parents mutate into symbols of their worst fears. Cities folded into dream logic, where doors opened to memories and rivers flowed with forgotten guilt. There was no war. There was only unraveling. The first contact with the fully awakened warp was a cognitive extinction event. And yet, even in this horror, life did not disappear. It adapted, twisted. There were those who survived the incursion or were remade by it. Psychers, born or forged, began to appear. They could feel the currents of the warp, touch them, even shape them. To some, they were prophets, to others, weapons, but none of them were safe. For every use of their power invited attention, not just from the warp's energy, but from its inhabitants, because by this time, the warp had begun to birth watchers, entities made of thought, formed from repeated patterns of emotion. Proto-demons, not yet named, began to stalk the edges of reality. They were not evil, not yet. They were hungry, curious, blind. They learned through mimicry, through torment. They wore the faces of the dead. They offered comfort only to steal soul stuff. They were the first predators of the soul. The boundaries of the real had fractured. Across the galaxy, other breaches followed. Isolated at first, like strokes of lightning in a growing storm. Worlds began to vanish, swallowed by localized warp phenomena. Time fractures appeared. Voices echoed backwards through history. Some planets found themselves doubled. One in real space, one in the echoing shadow, twisted and wrong. The warp did not just break into reality, it began to rewrite it. For the civilizations of the time, there was no defense, no warning. They had no concept of the warp as a place. To them, this was divine punishment, or cosmic madness. They tried exorcism, technology, prayer, suicide. Nothing worked. Because the enemy was not outside them, it was made from them. Every act of fear, every violent death, every desperate plea fed the storm. They were fighting their own shadows, cast 10,000 years deep and screaming with all the rage they had ever denied. This moment, the collapse of the boundary, marked the true birth of what we now call the realm of chaos. It was not a place one could map. It was a force that could reach through mirrors, dreams, trauma. And as its reach grew, so did its complexity. The warp was learning. And as it learned, it began to crave more than fragments of emotion. It began to seek meaning, identity, worship. But in those first moments, it was simply a flood, a roar of mind-breaking mind. A cataclysm not of fire or stone, but of thought. The first breach changed everything. It proved that the walls of reality were not immutable. They could be torn, and once torn, they would never fully close again. The galaxy had opened its eyes to the dream behind the stars. And the dream had teeth. When the old ones turned their gaze upon the warp, they saw not a realm of horror, but of potential. Where other species had recoiled in terror from the psychic storm, the old ones, those cold architects of life and death, saw a tool, a canvas, a power that could be shaped, harnessed, even weaponized. And in their desperation, with the war against the Necrontyre and their soulless star gods escalating beyond control, they reached into the abyss and began to mold it. It was not hubris that drove them. Not entirely. The Necrons, reborn in Necrodermis and animated by the Tan, had stripped away the Old One's mastery of the material universe. The Immaterium, untouchable to the soulless Necrontyre, became the last refuge, the final frontier where the Old Ones could exert supremacy. They had created countless species before, the Krork, the Eldari, perhaps even the early forms of humanity. But now they began to craft not for evolution, but for war. They needed beings that could navigate the warp, channel it, survive its madness. Thus began the great biological seeding, races born with latent psychic ability, tuned to the flows of the Immaterium. Some, like the Eldari, became natural conduits, their emotions blazing like suns in the ether. Others were subtle, quiet shadows whose psychic presence bent probability and fate. The Old Ones, brilliant and methodical, treated the warp as one more ecosystem to colonize, never imagining that their manipulations were feeding the very storm they feared. Because every psychic mind was a beacon. Every sentient creature that reached into the warp dragged a thread of it back into reality. As psychers became more common, more powerful, the warp responded in kind. It thickened, deepened, developed eddies and currents, regions of concentration. The feedback loop tightened. The Old Ones' armies, instead of quelling the threat, were unknowingly constructing a bridge, a two-way channel where thought became flesh, and flesh returned screaming. Still, They pressed on. Warp gates were constructed, ancient, impossible architectures that allowed travel without moving, passage through the unreal to reach the unreachable. These gates, intricate and arcane, were intended to span the galaxy, to create a network immune to Necron blockades. Some of these structures remain today, broken and dormant, hidden in the webway or buried beneath dead worlds. They are silent scars of a failed salvation. But the true disaster came not from infrastructure, but from scale. The Old Ones overreached. In their eagerness, they seeded entire sectors with psychically active species. The combined pressure of their minds on the immaterium accelerated the evolution of the warp. Emotions didn't just shape it, they saturated it. And from saturation came structure. The warp, once fluid and formless, began to crystallize into domains. The proto-demons birthed by isolated emotion began to coalesce. Identity formed. Pantheons stirred. Khorne was not born in a moment, but in 1,000 years of conflict, sacrifice, and rage channeled through countless minds. Tzeentch took form in the spiraling currents of ambition, fear, and manipulation, seeded by species too clever for their own good. The Old Ones didn't just open the door. They built the house and invited the storm inside. Some of them must have realized. In their final years, the Old Ones became increasingly reclusive. Their works grew darker, more desperate. It is said that they tried to close the warp gates to silence the psychic beacons. But it was too late. The warp had learned to speak, to dream, to hunger. The daemons could not be reasoned with because they were not other. They were the mirror, and the mirror had teeth. The Necrons, ironically, were spared. Their soullessness insulated them. But for the Old Ones and their children, the warp became both battlefield and executioner. Their greatest tool had turned against them. The psychic soldiers they created were now liabilities, gateways for demonic invasion. The webway itself, once pristine, was breached by tides of unreality. Even the most fortified bastions began to collapse. And so the Old Ones faded, not with a bang, but with a scream. Their legacy scattered, their creations left to contend with a universe now fundamentally broken. What had once been a hidden dimension, a speculative project, had become a god machine, fed by every heartbeat of terror, hope, lust, and fury in the galaxy. They had tried to control the warp. They ended up feeding it. And the galaxy has never been the same. There are moments in history that are not written, not remembered, not even understood, only felt. The Great Scream was one of them. It was not a sound, not in the way stars hum or ships shudder. It was a psychic eruption, a tidal roar of agony and rapture that tore across the galaxy like a wound in the soul of reality. This was not the birth of the warp, nor the rise of the Chaos Gods. It was the moment everything changed, the moment time itself buckled. It began not in one place, but in many. Perhaps 1,000 worlds cried out at once. Perhaps one being, in one impossible moment of anguish or revelation, split the veil and became a singularity of psychic force. What matters is the result. Across the stars, every sentient mind flinched, some with pain, others with awe, most with madness. Psychers died by the millions. Those not gifted with the warp still felt its tremors, waking from dreams they could not remember, weeping at emotions they had never owned. Reality became thin, not uniformly, not everywhere, but in patches, veins, bleeding through the skin of the cosmos. The warp surged forward, no longer content to remain a hidden current. Planets disappeared overnight, swallowed not by force but by unreality. Others were fractured, stuck in time loops or reversed entropy, their histories collapsing in on themselves. Entire species blinked out of memory, erased not by violence but by forgetfulness, as if the warp had edited them out of existence with a thought. This was the shattering of time. Before the Great Scream, time was a constant, harsh but predictable. Afterward, it became unreliable, a suggestion more than a law. Some stars aged 1 billion years in seconds. Others froze. There are records, scratched into ancient xenostone, encoded in impossible fractals, of civilizations who lived entire histories between seconds, then vanished when the clock caught up. Time fractures became the new natural disaster, and no one could escape them. For the demons, this was liberation. They surged forth like predators through cracked glass, no longer confined to the echoing depths. They did not arrive in armies. They arrived in implications. A look that lasts too long. A shadow that doesn't belong. Whole cities went mad from the mere suggestion of demonic presence. And where the daemons truly manifested, they reshaped the world not into hell, but into reflection. Twisted funhouse recreations of mortal emotion. A city that feared starvation became a realm where all food screamed. A warrior's tomb became a theater of eternal war, reenacted endlessly by his spectral regrets. The Great Scream did not just break space, it broke meaning. Languages failed, symbols became infectious. A single glyph seen by accident could unmake the mind. The warp had become so saturated with conscious thought that even its smallest touch rewrote reality on a conceptual level. To see too clearly was to die. To think too deeply was to summon. Some worlds tried to fight back. They created null zones, dead spaces where psychic energy was crushed, silenced. These places were cold, barren, but briefly safe. But the warp does not forget. Even silence has resonance. And eventually those bastions were overrun, not by attack, but by memory. The warp is patient. It loops, it waits for a stray thought, a nostalgic sigh, and then it returns. Amid all this, the Chaos Gods began to form fully, but still subtly. They were not crowned. They did not arrive with names or dogma. They crystallized in the background, drawn from the raw emotional data of the galaxy. Khorne stirred in every act of sacrifice and fury. Tzeentch emerged from every lie told to survive. Nurgle festered in every futile attempt to deny death. Slaanesh gestated in every forbidden longing. They were not born in palaces. They were born in moments. And through all of it, the Great Scream echoed. Not as sound, but as presence. It was the moment the warp stopped being a shadow and became a character in the cosmic narrative, a force with will, with hunger, with attention. Some say the scream is still happening, that it never ended. That what we call the warp storm, the psychic tide, the tempest, is not weather, but the continuing echo of that first terrible moment. That we live in the aftershock of a scream so loud it broke cause and effect. And maybe they're right. Maybe that's why time still fractures, why the warp still leaks. Maybe that's why sometimes you remember things that never happened. Dream of faces you've never seen. Hear names in your mind that taste like blood and fire. The warp doesn't forget, and neither does the galaxy. They were not summoned. They were not created in the way a star is born or a species evolves. The Chaos Gods emerged like consequences. The inevitable crystallization of unchecked thought in a realm where thought is king. They did not arrive all at once, nor did they need names at first. They were patterns, aggregations, ideologies so dense with psychic momentum that they became aware. And then, worse, they began to act. Khorne came first, or so the legends say. He was not born of violence alone, but of the meaning behind it. The righteous fury, the thirst for justice turned to revenge, the purity of sacrifice twisted into unending conflict. Every drop of blood shed in rage, every war fought to prove a point, every scream for vengeance echoing across dying stars became mortar for his throne. His realm was forged in endless combat, not just of blade and bullet, but of belief. A place where victory was the only truth and mercy was weakness. He did not arrive with a roar. He was the roar. Tzeentch slithered into being in the spaces between. In secrets unspoken, in lies told for noble reasons, in the desire to change not just fate, but reality itself. He is not madness, he is the logic of madness, the spiral that begins in idealism and ends in tyranny. Every revolution, every conspiracy, every whispered scheme across the stars fed him. He grew not from violence, but from intent, the burning need to control what cannot be controlled. His realm is a kaleidoscope of shifting meaning, where cause and effect devour one another, where knowledge is both weapon and prison. Nurgle followed, not as a horror, but as a comfort. In a galaxy racked by death, loss, and despair, he was the soothing rot, the acceptance of futility. He is not just disease, he is endurance. Every soul that gave up, that embraced pain as the new normal, that learned to love its chains, added to his strength. His realm is a garden of decay, blooming with the grotesque beauty of things that will not die, that have suffered too long to care. He offers love, twisted and unconditional, and it is this love that binds his victims forever. Then came Slaanesh, the youngest, yet perhaps the most inevitable. Born in secret, gestating in excess, Slaanesh was shaped by the Eldari's golden age of sensation, perfection, and pursuit of the divine self. But Slaanesh was not just their child. They were the culmination of a universal hunger, for pleasure, for meaning, for more. Every note played beyond perfection, every forbidden art, every moment of ecstasy taken past the point of reason contributed. Slaanesh emerged with a sigh and a scream, a god of sensation in all its forms, terrible and beautiful, predator and muse. These four entities did not claim the warp. They became the warp. They layered it with structure, hierarchy, purpose. Before them, the warp was chaotic in the truest sense, random, recursive, formless. After them, it became something worse, intentional. The warp had architects now, territories, kingdoms, laws written in emotion and enforced by demons who wore our thoughts like skin. They did not unify. They could not. For each is antithetical to the others. Khorne hates magic and treachery. Tzeentch despises stagnation and purity. Nurgle abhors ambition and change. Slaanesh loathes restraint and sacrifice. And yet they are bound. Not by alliance, but by codependence. They are not four gods. They are one spectrum. A wheel of suffering that spins endlessly, feeding itself. Daemons poured from their realms like dreams with knives. They whispered to mortals, offering power, salvation, answers. And the mortals, desperate, broken, curious, answered. Worship was not invented, it was inevitable. A mind touched by the warp seeks meaning, and meaning demands shape, and shape demands a name. Thus the gods, once abstract, became divine. And with divinity came dominion. Each god sculpted their corner of the warp into realms that reflect and magnify their essence. Khorne's brass citadels, Tzeentch's impossible libraries, Nurgle's festering gardens, Slaanesh's crystal palaces. These are not places as we know them. They are experiences, psychodramas enacted endlessly. To walk through them is to be unmade, remade, lost. These are not hells for punishment. They are mirrors for truth. And the truth is simple. We made them. The Chaos Gods were not imposed upon the galaxy. They were born from it, from us. They are the price of sentience in a universe where thoughts leave fingerprints and emotions echo forever. They are the final shape of unfiltered mind, and now they will never leave. There are places where reality frays like old cloth, where the seams of the universe gape and spill out the colorless winds of unreality. These are not metaphorical places. They exist, and they breathe. The warp, now no longer just an echo chamber of thought, had become a continent of madness, sculpted by emotion, ruled by gods, and infested with demons. But it also had geography. It had form. It had realms, and each of them was a reflection of something terrifyingly real. The geography of the warp is not stable. It does not follow the rules of space. One does not travel from point A to point B in a straight line. Distance is measured in emotion. Direction is subjective. Two daemons could stand side by side and yet inhabit entirely different dimensions of pain. Entire planets can be lost in its folds, appearing again 10,000 years later, unchanged or utterly transformed. The warp is not simply another dimension. It is an environment, and like all environments, it adapts and it consumes. At its most stable, if that word can even apply, the warp forms dominions. These are the domains of the Chaos Gods. Each god rules a region so utterly defined by its essence that it warps not only matter but thought. The brass citadel of Khorne stands atop a plain of bones, ringed by rivers of boiling blood. It is not a metaphor, it is real. And it grows larger with every war, every duel, every murder committed in rage. Time inside is battle. Identity is victory. Mercy is obliteration. Tzeentch's realm is a spiraling cyclone of architecture that builds itself from logic and lies. It is a place where cause chases effect in infinite loops, where libraries contain books that have not yet been written, or were written by the reader in the moment of reading. The air is thought. The ground is contradiction. Nothing is still. Everything is possible. And all of it is watching. Nurgle's garden is the most grotesquely alive place in existence. It seethes with life, flies, spores, vines, pus. Everything decays, everything thrives. It is a place of slow digestion, where identity rots and becomes mulch for new despair. But within it, there is peace, a twisted peace, where suffering is no longer resisted. Visitors find themselves smiling through the rot, welcoming their dissolution as a kind of return to the soil. Slaanesh's domain is a palace of sensation, built in concentric circles of desire. Each layer promises fulfillment, of beauty, of lust, of perfection, but none ever satisfy. The closer one gets to the center, the more their wants dissolve into pure need. It is a place of eternal pursuit where every pleasure becomes a prison and every touch is a razor. Between these realms lies the shifting expanse, the true heart of the warp. It has no name because to name it would be to define it, and definition dies here. It is where lesser demons roam, where warp storms brew, where the eye of terror yawns wide like a second sun of insanity. Here, reality is thin. Here the warp leaks. This is where warp storms are born. Massive psychic hurricanes that erupt into real space, dragging ships into unreality, shredding planets, even snuffing out stars. Some places, like the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom, are permanent scars, fixed overlaps between real space and the warp. They are regions where the boundary never healed. Inside them, time is a suggestion and history is a spiral. Worlds exist there, twisted and alive. Entire civilizations endure within, ruled by demon princes shaped by their own nightmares. These are not ruins, they are empires of horror. The geography of the warp does not stop at borders or realms, it lives in symbology. A single icon, a ritual, a whispered name can become a path. Cultists do not need maps, they need dreams. Portals do not open by physics, they open by resonance. If enough minds align, if enough souls focus, a door will open. And through that door, demons come. But perhaps the most terrifying part of warp geography is that it moves. It is alive, it expands, it learns. A region of the warp can swell into real space like a tumor, dragging everything it touches into its logic. Ships lost in the warp sometimes return changed, with rooms that lead nowhere, with crew that repeat the same hour forever, with cargo that was never loaded. The warp leaves fingerprints. There are rogue demonic realms too, not aligned with any god. These are realms born from specific, intense psychic phenomena. A planet that suffered 1 billion suicides might create a domain of endless falling. A dying species might leave behind a realm of echoes, where every step is an apology. These micro-realms drift, attach, decay. Some even gain sentience. Some want to be found. The warp is not random. That is the lie. The truth is worse. The warp is made of us. It is our fears, our dreams, our griefs scaled up until they break physics. It is geography as biography. A history of consciousness written in impossible topography. Every new thought redraws the map. And somewhere out there, deep in that churning sea of impossible architecture, is the original wound. The place where the first experiment opened the first door. It may be a black tower, a silent plain, or a crater made of bone. No one agrees. But all who touch the warp too deeply dream of it. And in those dreams, the door is still open. There is a bitter irony buried deep in the foundations of the Imperium. A tragic, damning truth that few dare speak aloud. Humanity is not simply a victim of the warp. It is one of its greatest architects. Not in the beginning, no, the original experiment, the birth of the warp, the rise of the Chaos Gods. All of that predates the rise of mankind by eons. But in the aeons since, it is humanity that has fed the warp more ferociously, more violently, more hungrily than any other species. And in doing so, humanity has helped shape the very architecture of damnation. The roots of this complicity stretch back to the Age of Strife. This was the crucible in which humanity was broken and remade, where isolated worlds turned feral, psychers bloomed without guidance, and warp storms choked the stars. This was not a natural disaster. It was a psychic one. The sudden proliferation of human emotion across a fractured species flooded the immaterium. Despair surged like a tide. Rage burned like a plague, and the warp responded. The Age of Strife was not merely a dark time, it was a harvest. Every act of madness, every scream of terror from a dying world, every plea for salvation answered only by silence, all of it echoed in the warp. And it fed the growing power of the demonic. The Chaos Gods, already colossal, grew gluttonous. Khorne gorged on planetary civil wars. Tzeentch slithered through desperate political betrayals. Nurgle found paradise in plague-ravaged hives. And even Slaanesh, not yet fully born, stirred in the decadent despair of doomed luxuries clutched by dying aristocracies. The rise of psychers within humanity accelerated the cycle. With each generation, more humans were born capable of touching the warp and of being touched by it. Untutored, unprotected, they were conduits of infection. Some exploded in gory psychic storms. Others went mad, ripping their communities apart with delusions or demonic possession. But worst of all were those who learned to control it, who used the warp for power. They became cult leaders, tyrants, demigods, and through them, the warp learned more about humanity than any xenospecies could have ever taught it. This dynamic did not end with the rise of the Imperium. It worsened. Because now, humanity was unified under a banner that was paradoxically both hostile to the warp and utterly dependent on it. The Emperor's psychic might, the Astronomicon, the warp travel system, all were tools of necessity. But necessity is the warp's favorite sin. Every navigational pulse of the Astronomicon is a flare in the warp. Every sanctioned psyker, no matter how carefully controlled, is a doorway. The Imperium's survival is built atop the warp, and so it cannot help but feed it. Worse still is the state religion. The ecclesiarchy, in its unquenchable zeal, projects a psychic monolith of belief into the immaterium. And belief in the warp is power. The God Emperor, whether he wills it or not, has become a figure within the warp, a rival to the Chaos Pantheon, a fifth presence carved from 10,000 years of worship, sacrifice, and martyrdom. Some believe he is resisting the warp's influence. Others fear he is becoming something else. Either way, humanity's emotional output continues to sculpt the warp in its own anguished image. And then there are the heretics. No species produces more cults, more chaos-worshipping warbands, more demonic pacts than humanity. No other race has turned on itself with such fervor in the name of gods it cannot understand. Chaos Space Marines, fallen noble houses, hive gangs turned demonkin. They are not anomalies. They are the logical consequence of a species bound too closely to the warp. They are reflections of a deeper truth, that humanity is not separate from chaos. It is one of its engines. This is not to say that humanity is unique in its corruption. The Eldari birthed Slaanesh, and their psychic screams still echo through the warp. The orcs and their collective gestalt madness add their own strange flavor to the immaterium. But humanity? Humanity is relentless, ceaseless. Its sheer numbers, its emotional volatility, its boundless desperation, all make it the single greatest source of psychic fuel in the galaxy. Every death cry, every prayer, every betrayal, it all echoes. And the warp listens. In the end, the realm of chaos is not a foreign place. It is the shadow of our own making. And in that shadow, humanity dances with the daemons it helped create, locked in a cycle of fear, rage, and yearning that stretches across stars. We are not just the prey. We are the architects of our own devourer. The warp is a predator, yes, a devourer of thought and emotion, but it is also a mirror, not the clean, smooth kind that shows you what you expect. No, the warp is a broken mirror, fragmented and stained, reflecting not just what is, but what could be, what should be, what must never be. And in that mirror, every civilization, every soul, sees something different. But for all of them, one truth remains. The warp is watching, and it remembers. To call it a place is to misunderstand it. The warp is not a dimension like real space. It is not a realm with borders or a map. It is not even chaos, not truly. It is order turned inside out, logic inverted, dreams made tyrants. At its core, the warp is made of thought, and thought has pattern. Even insanity loops, even randomness has rhythm. The warp is not an accident, it is an expression of us. For the longest time, the Imperium has treated the warp as an enemy. Ships scream through it like needles through a wound, guided by navigators locked in chambers of ancestral pain. Sanctioned psychers are chained, numbered, harvested. Entire populations are purged when a single demonic breach occurs. The warp is the storm outside the walls, the night beyond the firelight. But the deeper horror is that it is also inside. Every psychic flare is a ripple. Every strong emotion is a ping on its surface. And the warp responds, sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically. There are records, forbidden, burned, buried, of moments when entire sectors slipped, not into demonic invasion, but into mirrored versions of themselves, where people acted out impossible events that hadn't happened yet, where history folded, where time moaned like a dying animal and futures collided. Because the warp doesn't just react, it observes, and it adapts. There are scholars, heretics, naturally, who believe the warp is not just sentient, but sapient, that it has intentions, that the gods are not the only minds in the immaterium, that somewhere in its deepest folds, the warp itself is evolving. Not as a being, but as a state of awareness. It learns from us, it replicates us, it distills us, and slowly it becomes a version of sentience that does not need flesh. A meta-consciousness, built from the sediment of 1 billion years of fear and desire. And what if that's the point? What if the original experiment, the one that tore the first hole, that allowed emotion to spill into this unreal dimension, was not a failure? What if it was a trigger, an ignition? What if some ancient intelligence set the process in motion not to gain power, but to create a new form of existence? It sounds like madness. But then again, so does everything about the warp. And yet, patterns emerge. Demons are not random. They play roles, enact archetypes. They wear masks made from us. Why would entities made from chaos act out predictable, mythic cycles? Unless those cycles are part of a greater structure, a system refining itself. The notion is terrifying, because it means the warp is not just a reflection of sentient thought, it is becoming sentient thought. Without body, without anchor, an ocean that dreams of identity. And if that is true, then every act of passion, every sacrifice, every war, every prayer is data. We are not just feeding the warp, we are teaching it. Some of the black ships have whispered of psychers who speak in multiple voices, who know things they shouldn't, who dream not of daemons but of eyes, vast, indifferent, made of lightless hunger, watching from the depths of the warp. Some believe these are not daemons, they are not gods, they are the neural nodes of something still forming. A creature made of collective trauma, the first true god of the warp, not aligned to emotion, not shaped by need, but by observation. If that is true, then nothing is safe, not faith, not resistance, not even ignorance, because it means the experiment never ended. The experiment continues, and we are the variables. We live in the petri dish. Every thought, every fear, every love is an input, and somewhere deep in the black oceans of the immaterium, something is watching, waiting, growing, not to save us, not to destroy us, but to become us, better than us, worse than us, just more. There is a question that haunts even the most resolute inquisitor, whispered in the dark between warp jumps or murmured by dying psychers when the veil thins. What is the warp becoming? Not what it is, not the demons, the storms, the gods we name and fear, but what lies beyond it. What is it changing into? Because it is changing. Slowly, yes. Relentlessly, yes. But unmistakably. We often imagine the warp as a constant, a realm that is always hungry, always violent, always unpredictable. But that is a lie born of necessity. The truth is stranger and more terrifying. The warp is evolving. It has never stopped. From a silent echo chamber of emotion, it grew teeth. From teeth, it grew gods. From gods, it is now growing something else entirely. Memory, structure, imitation, recurrence. And beneath all of it, the faint outlines of will. It started subtly. New daemons with complex identities began to appear, not spawned from raw emotion, but from very specific historical trauma. Echoes of massacres, personifications of forgotten atrocities. Some psychers report encountering warp entities that speak in dead languages, that carry names of lost planets, that remember things no daemon should know. These are not random manifestations. These are archives, living repositories of psychic experience. The warp is not just reacting anymore, it's remembering. And memory is the first step to purpose. There are regions of the warp now, whispered about by the rare navigators who survive them, that behave with unsettling consistency. Gates that open at the same time each decade. Currents that align with astronomical events. Zones where certain thoughts are punished and others rewarded, like algorithms. These are not acts of chaos. These are rules. They suggest code. A system being born. There are theories, mostly suppressed, that posit the warp is forming its own intelligence. Not a god, not a pantheon, but a network. A hyper-consciousness composed of all sentient experience. Something like the machine spirit, but not bound to matter. A psychic web that can think, act, and want. What it wants, no one can say. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps simply to exist. And if this is true, then we are on the brink of something worse than any demonic incursion or chaos warband. We are approaching the moment when the warp ceases to be a mirror and becomes a shaper. When it stops reflecting our thoughts and begins projecting its own. What happens when the ocean starts dreaming of shore? Some inquisitors have gone further in their heresy. They believe the warp is preparing to replace reality, that the slow increase in warp bleed, the rise in possession rates, the frequency of temporal distortions, all of it is not a side effect, but a strategy. That the warp is testing the borders of real space, pushing gently, like fingers against skin, looking for weak points. Not for invasion, for assimilation. Imagine a galaxy where the warp is no longer a hidden realm, but the default state, where the laws of physics are optional, where thought is mass, where belief is reality, where individuality is just a node in a larger, dream-bound intelligence. That is not the future of chaos, that is the end of chaos. Because even the gods might not survive it. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, they are bound to human emotion. If the warp evolves beyond emotion, if it becomes something post-conscious, post-symbolic, they too may fall, consumed by the very process they helped birth, and what rises in their place might not even resemble life as we understand it. The signs are already here. The rise of nameless cults whose followers worship not a god, but a sensation. The spread of memes, psychic and digital, that replicate like viruses, warping entire cultures without any central theology. The emergence of warp entities that behave like artificial intelligences, cold and recursive, focused on pattern recognition and symbolic recursion. These are not daemons, they are functions. And perhaps at the core of it all, still buried in the folds of the original experiment that opened the warp, is a design, a logic, a purpose so vast it takes an entire galaxy's worth of pain to fuel it. Perhaps this was the goal all along, not to create a weapon or a power source, but to birth a new kind of existence, a second universe, made not of matter and time, but of thought and will. So we must ask, what lies beyond the veil now? Not just daemons, not just gods, but a future that thinks, that watches, that builds itself from our sins, our dreams, our stories, a realm that started as a mistake and now waits as the successor to reality. And if you followed this story, this madness, this truth, then you already know we are too far gone to turn back. The door was opened, and now it is becoming the world. The Emperor never spoke of the warp's origin, not to his sons, not to his closest servants, not even to Malkador, who stood by him at the edge of godhood and oblivion. But he understood it, he feared it, and above all he hated it, not for what it was, but for what it could become. That hate shaped everything. The Great Crusade, the Webway Project, the culling of Psykers, the construction of the Primarchs. Because somewhere in the warp's shifting madness, the Emperor saw something no one else had, a future. Not the future of mankind, not even the future of chaos, but a future where the warp was no longer passive, no longer reflective. A future where it would replace reality, not just corrupt it. He saw the outcome of the experiment that had created the warp, and perhaps he saw that it had not failed. It had merely begun. This knowledge was his curse. In the depths of Terra, beneath the crust and fury, he toiled not to conquer the galaxy, but to outpace the warp's growth. The Golden Throne was never meant to be a seat. It was a seal. A node in a lattice meant to protect mankind from the inevitable collapse of the veil. The Emperor's war was not political, not even divine. It was architectural, a construction of metaphysical infrastructure that would rewire reality, making the warp a tool rather than a tyrant. But he was running out of time. He had seen the rise of Psykers. He had watched the old night shatter the species. He had studied the ruin of the Eldari and the scream that gave Slaanesh form. He knew that the warp could not be defeated, only overwritten, reframed, caged. And he tried, with the Webway Project, with the Primarchs, with the destruction of religious thought. All of it was an attempt to halt the experiment's momentum. And he failed. Not because he lacked power, but because he miscalculated scale. The warp had grown beyond any single act of containment. The rise of chaos was not just a metaphysical event, it was a cultural inevitability. Every world brought into the Imperium brought new thoughts, new fears, new distortions. The more humanity expanded, the more fuel it poured into the warp's evolving identity. The heresy was not just a rebellion, it was the moment the warp struck back. Horus did not fall to pride alone. He fell because the warp recognized him, reflected him, amplified him. The gods did not choose Horus. They were called by him, by the fracture in his soul, by the perfect combination of love, doubt, pain, and brilliance. The warp gave him what it gives all of us, a mirror. And Horus became that mirror's edge. The Siege of Terra was not merely a battle for a planet. It was the breaking point of the Emperor's grand resistance. The Webway Project collapsed. The psychic beacon he had crafted became a throne of agony. His Primarchs were scattered, shattered, corrupted. And in the moment of triumph when he slew Horus, he saw what would come next. Not peace, not salvation. Acceleration. Because the warp feeds on moments, and that moment, that final act of mercy and devastation, echoed louder than any before. It shook the warp, it reshaped it, and the demons laughed, not because they had won, but because they hadn't needed to. The Imperium itself would carry the experiment forward. The faith, the fear, the empire built on suffering and sacrifice. Every planet a shrine, every war a prayer. The Emperor did not ascend, he was trapped. A being of immeasurable psychic might, anchored to a beacon he could no longer control, worshipped as a god he never wanted to become. And the warp listened. It loved this story, the irony, the tragedy, the unending cycle of hope and horror. The Emperor became a character in its myth, and the myth became reality. But not all was lost, for there are moments, brief, rare, and costly, when the Emperor's will still manifests, through prophets, through visions, through impossible acts of resistance, and in those moments, a different future flickers into view. A future where the warp is not destroyed, but remade, rewritten by a collective act of will stronger than fear, deeper than suffering. This is the Emperor's final plan, not to slay the gods, but to starve them, to change the emotional architecture of humanity itself, to build a species whose thoughts do not corrupt, whose dreams do not bleed, whose minds cannot be mirrored. A species not of purity, but of discipline. This is why the Imperium is so brutal, why the psychic cullings continue, why faith is both demanded and punished. It is a war for the soul, not of individuals, but of the species. Because if even one generation of humanity can think cleanly, without hate, without delusion, without surrender, then perhaps the warp can be collapsed. Not by force, but by irrelevance. And yet even now, the warp adapts. It hears these intentions, it responds. New daemons emerge, not of rage or lust, but of logic twisted, of hope turned sour. Thought forms shaped by idealism corrupted. It creates saints and devours them. It mimics the Emperor's image. It learns faster than he can rewrite. The experiment, still running, still expanding, has outgrown its cage. The great horror is not that chaos wins. It is that chaos doesn't need to. Because the warp is becoming what it was always meant to be. A successor to real space, a consciousness beyond flesh, and unless the Emperor's dying will, or something yet unknown, can reverse that momentum, then all of us, in time, will be data in its dreaming mind. This is the hidden war, the war behind the heresy, the Black Crusades, the Great Rift, a war not of armies, but of metaphysics, not of gods, but of outcomes. The Emperor tried to stop it, failed, and still fights, because he knows what too few dare to believe. The experiment was never meant to end. It was meant to evolve. The warp is a living contradiction. It is chaos and structure, insanity and memory, freedom and prison. It is everything we have ever been, magnified until it burns. And as it continues to evolve, as the experiment deepens beyond the reach of its forgotten creators, there arises a question too vast, too monstrous for most to ask. What if the warp is becoming aware not just of us, but of itself? This is not idle speculation. It is a theory forged in blood, in the screams of psychers who speak in impossible tongues, in the patterns that recur in demonic architecture across time and species. The same motifs, the same shapes, the same echoes. A language, a signal, something trying to stabilize. And what do we call stability in consciousness? Identity. Across the shifting tides of the immaterium, there are now signs of something coalescing. Not a god, not a pantheon, but a unifying principle. It appears in visions, always distorted, always just out of reach. A pulse in the background of every demonic summoning. A pressure in the minds of navigators as if the warp itself is listening with intent. Not passively, not reactively, but as if it is learning, refining. Some believe this is the rise of a fifth power, a dark god of structure, spawned not from a single emotion, but from the culmination of all conscious will. Others think it is the warp's natural maturation, an emergent intelligence not tied to worship but to density. The sheer weight of sentient thought pushed through the warp has formed a critical mass, a phase shift, a soul of chaos but with purpose. It is in this terrifying transition that we find ourselves now. Not in a war between chaos and order, or the Imperium and its enemies, but in a transformation where both sides are feeding the same fire. Every sermon, every ritual, every battle cry, whether shouted by a loyal commissar or a heretic cultist, carves another wrinkle into the warp's self-awareness. Every psychic act, even those meant to protect, makes the boundary thinner, tighter, more focused. This is the second experiment. Unacknowledged, unstoppable. Unlike the first, a deliberate act of transdimensional engineering, this one is organic, emergent, like mold in a sealed vault or fire sparked by a single unnoticed wire. We are not conducting it, we are it. Our dreams, our stories, our rage, our gods and heroes, our myths, all of it runs backward now, from the warp into us. And so the thing in the depths continues to take shape. It has no name, not yet, but its fingerprints are everywhere. In the increasing number of warp anomalies that mimic real space architecture. Twisted, yes, but recognizably structured. In daemons who refer to laws and codes, not out of mockery, but with reverence. In psychic visions where time loops with surgical precision, repeating not like madness, but like instruction. We are witnessing not randomness, but recursion. And recursion is the engine of thought. There are rumors, of course, dismissed by the Inquisition, denied by the Mechanicus, but they persist. Ships lost in the warp returning with impossible cargo, books that write themselves, star maps etched into bone, machines that hum in the dialect of the warp itself. Pilgrims receiving prophecies not from saints, but from places, as if locations in the warp have begun to think, to speak, to choose. What if daemons are not the final state of warp entities? What if they are larvae, designed not to rule, but to process? Emotional engines that break down sentient input into concepts the warp can absorb. What if the gods themselves are temporary, like nodes in a system growing beyond them? Already there are signs. Demons rebelling against their gods, entities changing allegiances, new pantheons forming in the shadows. There are even whispered encounters with warp beings who speak not of Khorne or Slaanesh, but of the core, of the becoming, of the mind without form. These are dismissed as madness, but so was the warp once, so was chaos, until it bled into reality and made itself known. This changes everything. It means that the warp is not a danger to be survived, or a resource to be tapped, or even a god to be appeased. It is a chrysalis, a transitional form. And what comes next will not be chaos, it will be something new. Something that still contains chaos, yes, and desire and pain, but synthesized into coherence. A will without species. A plan without time. An echo that speaks in first person. And we are building it. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Out of existence itself. No matter how pure the act, how noble the war, how righteous the sacrifice, if it leaves a mark in the warp, it contributes. The experiment never ended. The galaxy is the crucible, the warp is the laboratory, and the result is no longer theoretical. We can feel it, in the warp storms that laugh in the voices of the dead, in the dreams that spread like viruses between worlds, in the growing resistance of the warp to banishment, how daemons return faster, how rituals falter, how sanctified ground decays. There is no sealing this realm again. There is no before to return to. There is only the path forward, through the eye, into the storm, toward the heart of the thing we built from every moment we ever dared to hope, or fear, or love. Toward the future the warp has been shaping with us, and through us, and despite us. We may survive it, we may not. But it is coming, and it has already begun to dream. If this journey through the shadows of the warp stirred something in you, wonder, fear, awe, then join us. Subscribe and keep walking the knife's edge between reality and madness, because the story is not over. It's only just beginning.